Every ancient civilization on every continent independently invented the same monster, giant serpent, lives in water, eats people. The Norse had Jörmungandr, the Greeks had the Hydra, Aboriginal Australians had the rainbow serpent, the Aztecs had Quetzalcoatl, the Chinese had the long. Cultures that had zero contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all came up with the same creature. Either there was some kind of prehistoric group chat where everyone agreed on the lore, or something was actually in the water. If you saw the last video about doctors who were convinced they were helping while actively killing people, this is the same brain at work. Just a few thousand years earlier, humans are pattern recognition machines. We see something we don't understand, and we build a story around it. The doctors built a story called "_0." Ancient civilizations built a story called "_1." The question isn't whether the stories were accurate, it's what they were looking at when they wrote them. Let's start with the Kraken, because this one got solved and nobody got the apology they deserved. For hundreds of years, Scandinavian sailors reported a creature in the North Atlantic so large it could drag entire ships underwater, tentacles the length of a mast, eyes the size of dinner plates. Every navy in Northern Europe had accounts. The scientific community responded the way the scientific community usually responds to sailors. They ignored it. Then, in 2004, a Japanese research team lowered a camera to about 900 meters in the Pacific Ocean and filmed a giant squid alive for the first time. Architeuthis ducks, tentacles up to 13 meters long, eyes the size of dinner plates, lives in deep water, and occasionally surfaces when injured or disoriented. The thing sailors had been describing for centuries was real, had always been real, and had been sitting at 900 meters waiting for someone to bring a camera. Every single detail in the Kraken myth, the tentacles, the size, the depth, the ship grabbing, was a roughly accurate description of a real animal. The sailors weren't lying. They were filing incident reports in a world without cameras. Now, dragons. Dragons are interesting because the myth exists in almost every culture, but the creature described is slightly different everywhere. European dragons fly and breathe fire. Chinese dragons are long, serpentine water creatures. Southeast Asian dragons are closer to crocodiles, which sounds like a problem until you realize it's actually the answer. European dragons almost certainly come from a Venn diagram of three things medieval people encountered: large reptiles, wildfires, and bones. If you're a farmer in 12th century France and you find a dinosaur skull, which happened more often than you'd think, you don't have the concept of ___, what you have is a very large skull with very large teeth and no animal you've ever seen that matches it. So you invent one. Add a wildfire that someone saw from a distance, smoke, flames, something large moving through the trees, and you have a flying, fire-breathing reptile. The dragon isn't one animal. It's a composite sketch drawn by people who were doing their best with terrible information. Southeast Asian dragons, on the other hand, were probably just Komodo dragons. Actual Komodo dragons. 3-meter lizards with toxic saliva, a top speed that will ruin your afternoon, and a hunting strategy that involves biting you once and then following you for days while the infection does the work. Western science didn't formally document Komodo dragons until 1910. Local populations in Indonesia had been living with them for thousands of years and had, quite reasonably, decided they were dragons, because, for all practical purposes, they are. If your definition of "3" is "4" the Komodo dragon qualifies on every metric. Now here's where the bestiary gets really interesting. The roc, a giant bird from Arabian and Persian mythology that was said to carry off elephants. Marco Polo mentioned it. Sinbad fought one. Most historians filed it under obvious exaggeration. Then paleontologists found the remains of Haast's eagle in New Zealand. Wingspan of about 3 meters, weighed up to 15 kilograms. Hunted moa, flightless birds that weighed up to 230 kilograms. This eagle was large enough and aggressive enough to attack animals 10 times its weight by diving onto them from above and crushing their spines with talons the size of a tiger's claws. It went extinct around 1400 AD, roughly when the Maori hunted the moa to extinction and the eagles lost their food source. Haast's eagle couldn't carry an elephant, but it could absolutely kill a human. And if a bird the size of a hang glider dives out of the sky and drives its claws into your back, the story you tell when you get home is not going to be an accurate description of a 15-kilogram raptor. It's going to be a bird the size of a house that carried you off into the mountains. Because that's what it felt like. And that's how myths work. They're not transcripts. Their experience reports filtered through adrenaline and no formal education. Sea serpents follow the same pattern. For centuries, sailors reported enormous snake-like creatures on the surface of the ocean. Long, undulating, bright silver. Marine biologists now know these were almost certainly oarfish, the longest bony fish in the ocean, reaching up to 11 meters, with a bright silver body and a red dorsal crest that runs the entire length. They live in deep water and occasionally surface when dying or disoriented. A dying oarfish on the surface of the ocean, undulating in the current, viewed from a wooden ship by a sailor who has been at sea for 4 months and has very limited reference points for marine biology, is a sea serpent. That's not a failure of observation. That's a completely rational interpretation given the available data. Mermaids, almost certainly manatees and dugongs, viewed from a distance by sailors who had not seen a woman in a very long time. This one is less flattering to the sailors. Manatees weigh about 500 kilograms and have a face that, with the greatest possible respect, does not resemble a beautiful woman from any distance. Christopher Columbus himself reported seeing mermaids off the coast of Hispaniola and noted that they were quote, _6, which is the most generous review a manatee has ever received. The Cyclops is probably the best one. Ancient Greeks found skulls of Dinotherium, an extinct relative of the elephant, on Mediterranean islands. The skull has a large central nasal cavity where the trunk attached. If you've never seen an elephant, that nasal cavity looks exactly like a single, enormous eye socket. One skull, one hole in the center, one very obvious conclusion. The Greeks weren't inventing monsters. They were doing archaeology without a degree, which brings us to the part that actually matters. If every myth we've looked at turns out to be a distorted but fundamentally real observation, serpents were real, the Kraken was real, dragons were composites of real animals, the Cyclops was a real skull, then mythology isn't fiction, it's data. It's the world's oldest field reporting, recorded by people who had no framework for what they were seeing, using the only tools they had: story, metaphor, and fear. The medieval bestiary wasn't a book of fairy tales. It was an attempt to catalog a dangerous world using the best available information. It was wrong about the details. It was right about the danger. The Kraken really could kill you. The Komodo dragon really will follow you for 3 days after biting you. Haast's eagle really did hunt humans. The data was real. The interpretation was mythological, which raises one obvious question. What are we making myths about right now? What are we observing today, describing confidently, and getting fundamentally wrong? Not because we're stupid, but because we don't have the framework yet. 1,000 years from now, someone is going to look at something we believed and react the same way we react to the Cyclops skull. And they'll be right. Some of these creatures, by the way, turned out to be very real and very much still alive, but the ones hiding in caves are a different kind of terrifying. That's a whole other problem.